Have you ever wondered why the strongest reaction comes not when you stay, but when you leave? When a woman who once poured herself into love finally turns and walks away, not with fury, but with finality, the unraveling begins. Not in her, but in him, the man who believed she would always be there, the man who mistook her presence for permanence. At first, he may say the words casually, as if they're small, as if they cost nothing. She was too much. She changed. I just need space. But if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with your soul, you'll hear it. The fraying edge, the tightening grip, the beginning of collapse. You see, most men aren't afraid of being left. They're afraid of what they see in the mirror after you're gone. Because when a woman with depth, power, and grace walks away, she takes her reflection with her. And what's left behind is the shadow, raw, unfiltered, unpolished. No more validation. No more emotional cushion. Just silence and the echo of his own unhealed wounds. If he says, "I didn't think she meant it," he's not talking about your words. He's confessing how little he understood your worth. If he says, "I don't recognize her anymore," he's projecting his own unfamiliarity with growth, strength, and boundaries because he never expected you to find your power. If he says, "She became cold," what he's really saying is, she stopped pouring herself into a cup that was never meant to hold her. Carl Jung spoke of the anima, the feminine within the male psyche. For many men, the women they desire are not women at all, but projections of their unconscious anima. Mystery, beauty, validation, comfort, chaos. She's not seen, only summoned. And when you finally become real, when your boundaries appear, when your silence replaces softness, when your gaze no longer seeks approval, you rupture his fantasy. Not because you failed him, but because you woke him. And waking is not always a gentle process. So when he says, "She never really loved me," know that he is trying to rationalize your leaving. Because the truth that you loved him deeply and still chose to walk is unbearable. He cannot reconcile the idea that a woman could both adore him and outgrow him. This is the unraveling, and it starts subtly. Sleepless nights, scrolling through old messages, imagining your life without him, then realizing you already have one. Because the woman who leaves with dignity, who doesn't beg, explain, or blame, becomes an enigma. And the male psyche cannot resolve enigma. It must pursue. It must solve. It must possess. But you become unpossessable. And that is what haunts him most. You see, there's a particular kind of man who only recognizes value when it's gone. Not because he's cruel, but because he was never taught to sit with longing without conquest, to feel without control, to be present without fixing. So when you leave and he says, "I didn't know she meant so much to me," it's not a compliment. It's a confession of blindness. By then, it's too late. You've transcended the role he gave you. No longer the fantasy. No longer the emotional caretaker. You are now the mirror he turned away from. And every time he speaks of you, it will not be as a woman who needed him, but as the woman who no longer does. He is unraveling not because you're gone, but because in your absence, he finally sees himself. And the version of you that haunts him is the one who never raised her voice, never pleaded, never tried to prove her worth. She simply left, with her dignity intact. He thought your silence was surrender, but it was strategy. It was sacred, because a high-value woman does not explode, she evaporates. Not in a puff of smoke or storm of rage, but like morning mist burned off by clarity, by the slow dawn of self-respect. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you started seeing. And what you saw, the pattern, the projection, the limitation, no longer aligned with your becoming. In the psychology of Jung, this is individuation, the sacred fracture between who you were told to be and who you actually are. The moment a woman discards the mask of pleaser, fixer, nurturer at all costs, and reclaims her soul as sovereign. When he says, "She changed," he doesn't mean you became cruel. He means you stopped collapsing to make him feel strong. You stopped softening your tone to make him feel wise. You stopped dimming your light so he wouldn't feel blind beside you. That change, that expansion, terrifies a man who clings to the past version of you he could control. Because now, he must meet you soul to soul, not ego to ego. And most men are unprepared for that intimacy. So he starts to speak from the fracture. She thinks she's better than me. She gave up on us. She's not the same woman I fell in love with. But of course you're not. You were never meant to stay as the version he fell for. You were meant to rise. You were meant to evolve, to leave behind the girl who waited to be chosen, and become the woman who chooses herself. This is what shatters him. Not the absence of your body, but the absence of your need. He can't romanticize that. He can't rewrite the story to make himself the victim. Because deep down, he knows you waited. You gave chances. You warned with kindness. You loved with intensity. And still, he mistook your patience for permanence. Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And nothing forces a man to face his soul like losing the woman who once made him feel whole. But you were never his missing piece. You were the mirror, and mirrors don't break, they reflect. So now, when he hears your name, or sees your favorite book, or catches a song you once danced to barefoot in the kitchen, something tugs at him. Not nostalgia, but recognition. Recognition that he had the kind of love that was deep, divine, disruptive to the smallness of his identity, and he let it dissolve. Not because it was wrong, but because it required him to rise. And when you walked away, you didn't just take your affection. You took the version of him that only existed in your presence. Now he speaks of you not as the one who got away, but as the one who revealed the truth. That love is not measured in possession. It's measured in presence, in courage, in the willingness to meet you where you are. And he wasn't ready. So he blames you, says you were too intense, too deep, too sensitive, too much. But the truth is, you were exactly enough for a man brave enough to feel. He was not that man. So now, he haunts himself with the very things he once dismissed. Your quiet glances, your late-night questions, your unwavering belief in who he could become. Because you were never just a woman to him. You were the crossroads. And he took the path of comfort, now haunted by what courage might have given him. ChatGPT said, he doesn't tell his friends the whole truth. He talks about how you changed, about how things just drifted. He leaves out the parts where you stared into the void of his indifference and decided it was better to walk alone than be emotionally starved while lying next to someone every night. He doesn't say that you lowered your voice until it was a whisper, that you stopped asking for more because begging robs a woman of her dignity, that you started sleeping with your back to him, not out of malice, but because you finally needed to feel the space that was already there. So he builds his narrative carefully, that you became cold, that you stopped trying, that you didn't fight for him. But here's what men like him never admit. A high-value woman does not fight for a place in a man's life. She observes, and once she sees that her presence is being tolerated instead of treasured, she quietly exits. Not to teach him a lesson, not to manipulate his emotions, but because her own soul cannot survive in a space that poisons her light. This is the unraveling. It doesn't begin when she walks away. It begins when she stops explaining, when her softness dries up, when she no longer fills the room with life. And when a man says she just turned off, what he's really admitting is she stopped performing love for someone who never truly saw her. Carl Jung taught that the psyche holds both the shadow and the gold, that the parts of ourselves we reject, our guilt, our grief, our wounds, are also the keys to our transformation. So when a high-value woman withdraws, she becomes the embodiment of both shadow and gold, the mirror of everything he suppressed and the memory of what he lost when he refused to evolve. He'll look for you and others, not because he wants someone new, but because he wants the version of himself that only existed in your presence. He'll scroll through old photos, zoom in on your smile, search your eyes for signs of anger, but find only distance. Because when a woman like you leaves, she doesn't carry rage. She carries reclamation. And that's what terrifies him. Not your silence, not your absence, but your freedom. The woman he could once predict now exists outside his logic. She's no longer emotionally available to soothe his ego or decode his distance. She has become a mystery again, not because she's hiding, but because she's healing. And healed women don't return to the hands that hurt them. They return to themselves. So when he says, "I still think about her," he's not reminiscing. He's reckoning with the way he dismissed your tears, with the times he chose pride over presence, with the way he mistook consistency for convenience. You were not a phase. You were the possibility of a deeper manhood, the kind that chooses growth over comfort, vulnerability over bravado, real love over power plays. But he wasn't ready. So now, when he finds himself lying awake, when he scrolls through social media, searching for signs you still care, when he drafts messages he'll never send, it's not you he misses. It's who he could have become beside you. The world doesn't teach men how to mourn the woman who raised their emotional standards. It teaches them to replace, to distract, to deny. But what haunts him isn't the void you left. It's the man he never stepped into, the one who could have met your depth, matched your strength, held your truth with tenderness. And now, that man lives only in memory, as a whisper, a could have been, a version of him you believed in, until he proved he wasn't ready to believe in it himself. He walks through life now with an ache he cannot name. Not loud, not sharp, but lingering, constant, like the aftershock of a storm that never quite passed. He smiles, he works, he moves on, or so it seems. But something in him broke the day you decided to become unavailable to emotional breadcrumbs. Because that's all he ever gave, crumbs. A sprinkle of attention here, a dash of affection there. Enough to keep you hopeful, but never enough to feed your soul. And then, one day you stopped reaching. You stopped dancing for his crumbs and started craving the feast your spirit had always deserved. This is what he fears most. Not your rage, not your tears, but your indifference. Because indifference is irreversible. It is no longer emotional. It is existential. He may say, "She became distant," but what he means is, "She no longer orbits my gravity." And for a man who was never taught to love without control, that loss of pull, that loss of emotional access, feels like death. Jung wrote that every man must confront his own inner feminine, his anima, or else he will seek her obsessively in the external world, projecting onto women his unmet need for wholeness. So when you walked away, you didn't just leave him. You took his projection with you. You took the dream version of you he built in his mind, the one who forgave endlessly, who asked for little, who didn't require him to grow. And now, stripped of illusion, he must face the real feminine, not the girl who waits, but the woman who withdraws. And he doesn't know what to do with that, because for the first time, he cannot charm it. He cannot seduce it. He cannot manipulate it. It simply exists beyond his reach. So when he says, "She gave up," he's grieving control, not connection. Because true connection requires capacity. And capacity requires depth. And depth requires a willingness to descend into the inner world. He wasn't willing. You were. You were ready to meet him in the depths, but he chose the shallow end. And now, he stands on the edge of the emotional ocean you once offered, staring into its vastness, wishing he had learned to swim. He will try to replace you. He will find someone easier, someone who doesn't challenge his ego, who doesn't speak the language of wounds, who doesn't see through his bravado. But it won't last, because once a man has known the presence of a woman in her power, he can never fully settle into pretense again. She haunts not as a ghost, but as a mirror, reflecting what he refused to become. He will remember your silences more than your words. He will remember your eyes more than your body. He will remember the day you left, not because it was dramatic, but because it was definitive. And one day, long after the dust has settled, he will sit in stillness, and the memory will come of your laughter, your warmth, your unwavering heart. Not as a loss, but as a reckoning, a reminder that the feminine does not beg. She invites, and when the invitation is refused, she walks. Not with malice, but with majesty, because the woman who knows herself, who has done her inner work, who understands her worth, she does not collapse for a man who can't see her. She rises, and in her rising, she leaves behind only truth. That is what he cannot forget. That is what undoes him. Not the ending, but the awakening it demands. He thought time would erase you. He thought routine would dull the echo of your absence. That distance would bury your memory beneath noise and novelty. But time, to a man who never learned how to sit with himself, does not heal. It exposes. Because the more he tries to forget you, the more he remembers what you reflected. That real love is not possession. It's presence. That intimacy is not built on words, but on the willingness to see and be seen. And you saw him, more than he was ready for. You saw the boy behind the man, the armor behind the smile, the fear behind the bravado. But he mistook that gaze for intrusion. He flinched from your softness. He called it too much, when really it was too true. So now he walks with ghosts, not of who you were, but of who he might have become had he stayed, had he softened, had he met you not with defense, but with depth. Carl Jung warned, what you resist not only persists, but grows in size. He resisted you. He resisted the medicine of the feminine, the discomfort of being fully seen, the terror of being held accountable without being condemned. And now, what persists is not your voice, but your silence. Not your touch, but the absence of your nurturing energy. Not your presence, but the knowledge that you were real, and he failed to rise to meet you. So when he says, I just need closure, he's not seeking understanding. He's seeking permission to let go of a woman he never fully held. He's seeking to make peace with a decision he knows he'll never truly forgive himself for. But closure does not come from conversation. It comes from confrontation with the self. And that is the journey he cannot avoid. He will try to replace your energy with imitation. He'll date someone less demanding, someone who doesn't challenge his depth, someone who doesn't awaken his shadow. But one day, in a quiet room, with no distractions left, he'll feel it, the unmistakable grief of potential unmet, of depth avoided, of love feared. And in that moment, he will finally understand you weren't asking too much. You were asking for truth, and he wasn't ready to live that truth. So you left, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to preserve the sacredness of your own becoming. And now, you no longer look back, not because you stopped caring, but because your soul refuses to return to places that require self-abandonment. This is the power of the awakened feminine. She loves with openness, but walks with clarity. She nurtures deeply, but does not negotiate her intuition. She gives endlessly, but not at the cost of herself. And when she walks away, she does so not as a warning, but as a lesson. He will see you again, not in the flesh, but in the reflections that life throws at him. In every woman who reminds him of what he lost. In every still moment when his own voice echoes, unanchored, without the warmth of your grounding love. He will wonder what you're doing if you still think of him, if the door is still open. But the woman you are no longer exists. She's evolved, expanded, elevated, and now she belongs to herself. Because the highest form of love is not waiting. It is choosing. And the woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.